Welcome to Top 5, a show where we get up early in the morning, still wearing our pajamas, pour a big old bowl of Cocoa Puffs, and plop our butts down in front of the TV. And did I mention, it's 4:30 a.m. Actually, it's Top 5, and this week on Top 5,
What?
Top 5 Saturday morning cartoons. Oh, man,
You
I
got
remember
up at 4 a.m.?
Like, as a little kid, there were a couple times when I would get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning and go downstairs and turn on the TV, and like it would have, I forget what kind of shows they had on that early in the morning. They had like some farm report show that was on.
Ag Day.
I think that's what it was. Before the cartoons would start around 6, and I'd sometimes sit there and watch that. And I think Big Blue Marble was on at 5:30 or 6 in the morning.
I loved Big Blue Marble. Oh my God, that was weird.
Yeah. And what was that? Zoom? No, that was in the 70s, right? That was in the 70s,
but
right?
Zoom was in syndication forever.
Oh, okay. All right.
So yeah, Zoom was still being syndicated when we were in, college. Actually, I think there was a new Zoom when we were in college, but still.
Yeah. I went.
Yeah, they make new Zooms every like 10 years or so.
Yeah.
WGBH is like, hey, is it time to Zoom again?
Mm-hmm. I want to zoom. Oh wait,
no, that's something different.
Anyway, my Saturday morning cartoons, I tried to keep them non-syndicated. So these would be on your main network channels.
Of which there were 3.
4, if you count the 41s that sometimes had some weird stuff. But also
syndicated.
Some of the stuff as we got older, Fox Television as well. So, who would like to start? Rodrigo, how about you start us off this week with your number 5 Saturday morning cartoon?
So, my number 5, and it's important to kind of get some context here. When I was a kid, my mom was okay with me watching some TV, but definitely not with me watching cartoons all day on Saturday. And I grew up at a time where they did have cartoons all morning on Saturdays.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, you either have TV channels that air other stuff, or you have, cartoon cable channels. Like the Saturday morning cartoon is kind of gone, except on like PBS and a couple other places, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in order to maximize my cartoon watching abilities, I would get up super early in the morning, like 4 a.m. I'd watch like a couple episodes of like Gilligan's Island or whatever was on that early. There was like a show called Dear John.
Yeah. That was John Larroquette, I believe.
Yeah. So I'd watch that. Don't remember anything about it. And
it's
then
about a guy whose wife leaves him. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
And then the cartoons would start, and it was like the Hanna-Barbera Power Hour. So it was like Two Stupid Dogs and my number 5, SWAT Cats, which I only recently realized SWAT Cats SWAT Cats subtitle is SWAT Cats The Radical Squadron, which I don't ever remember them voicing. Like maybe it was written on there somewhere, but this is apparently what the cartoon is called. I found out as I was researching stuff for this show. So SWAT Cats is about these two anthropomorphic cats who living in like an anthropomorphic animal city, and they have cool planes and like largely non-lethal like net guns, and they have cool claws, and they run around and fight crime. It is not a great cartoon, but it definitely makes my top 5 because it was very different from other stuff that was on at the time, even though like looking back on it is like so clearly like, oh no guys, it's the 90s and we weren't prepared for this. Cats, awesome. Just have them say awesome a lot. But
I was confused then with Samurai Pizza Cats.
Yeah, they have a similar sort of like a similar armor type style, but Samurai Pizza Cats are a lot more like little tiny guys with like giant heads, whereas SWAT Cats were really trying to give them like humanoid proportions with just like a little bit of a cartoon exaggeration.
Are they roughly analogous in terms of their timing? Contemporaneous is probably the word I'm looking for.
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. I'm not really sure when Samurai Pizza Cats came out in Japan, but when it came to the US, I think they were probably airing close to the same time. So my number 5, Sawant Cats, apparently the Radical Squadron.
Radical, dude.
Radical Squadron.
Did they say wiggity wiggity a lot?
No, but I'm sure they had some like Ninja Turtle-y, like
they were
Rama Lama Ding Dong kind of.
They were named T-Bone and Razor, which was amazing to me.
Yep.
I'm like, what?
Matthew, what do you have for number 5, Matthew?
My number 5 is actually really kind of one of the formative things of my youth. And I've told the story about how I didn't get into comic books until I was told I was too old for reading comic books. But I had been watching television by that time for almost half a decade. And one of the things that I always found myself drawn to on television were adventure type stories and adventure fiction stories. And, crap like Jason of Star Command, which isn't a cartoon, so it won't be on this list. But one that kept popping up because it combined 3 of my obsessions was Space Ghost, because it had space, it had cool flying ships, and the dude flying it also had a really awesome costume and a mask and a cape, and I'm like, oh well, whatever. But it also had amazing voice work. It had Gary Owens in that main role, and a lot of times with those Hanna-Barberas, especially the Hanna-Barberas of the 60s, and to some degree going back into the 50s, what you would get is super limited animation where you'd see the same things and the same, rotoscoped motions, but you would have such amazing voice work that you could literally watch the same episode. You could watch him, fight the same villain, but have completely different dialogue over it. And it was just exciting and amazing. And I'm like, ooh, wow, these guys with capes things, there might be something to this. But I didn't really, explore that for a couple of years later. But my number 5, just amazing. And there's only like 18 or 20 like original episodes. No,
just keep rerunning them.
There were like 18 or 20 of them, and then they made new ones in the 80s that were less cool because they tied them into like the Space Stars, and that was all. Yeah. That was definitely aimed at young baby children.
Can't remember, was the Space Monkey always a part of Space Ghost?
Yes, Blip.
Okay, Blip, yeah.
Space Ghost was the last survivor of the Star Force, and he had his 2 little sidekicks who never really had any explanation. There was Jan and Jace, and Jace was a young Tim Matheson who also did great voice work. And I want to say Jan was actually June Foray, if I'm not mistaken. But they had their monkey. They had their monkey like almost a decade before Zan and Jaina had their monkey. And of course, later, I don't know if you knew this, those 2 monkeys fought to the death. But that's another story entirely. But Space Ghost, which apparently debuted in 1966 and ran those same 25 episodes for 20 years. And, the Mort Weisinger, every 2 years, we have a whole new audience parable, worked for them forever, because that show was on theoretically first run Saturday morning TV when I was a kid, which would have been the late 70s. Love that show, top to bottom.
Yep. My number 5 should come as no surprise. I mentioned I got up early in the morning to tiptoe downstairs because, if I'm not mistaken, the very first cartoon that I would get to watch on Saturday morning had Superman and Batman and Robin and Aquaman and Wonder Woman and Wendy and Marvin and their dog Frodo.
No, their dog Wonder Dog.
Oh, I'm sorry, Wonder Dog. I'm, of course, talking about the 1973-74 Super Friends series that had Ted Knight in there. Oh, man. Love Ted Knight as the
77, actually.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm just talking about the original first run because, man, there's a reason why I got up early in the morning to watch Super Friends, and it wasn't for Marvin or Superman. Wendy was pretty hot.
Wendy was pretty hot. She had those flare pants and that Betty Boop haircut.
Yep.
You were 5 or 6, but
no, we were 3 in 1973, dude.
Yeah, but we weren't watching it in 1973.
Oh, I was.
That thing aired every year forever, and they didn't make new episodes till 77.
Yeah, no, I watched in 73 because we lived at the old house, and we moved to where my parents live now in 75. So I know I was watching Super Friends at 3 and 4 years old, and that's why I would get in trouble getting up so early in the morning to go watch the Super Friends. And oh man, it's cool. If you haven't ever seen the Super Friends, go track it down. It's super cool.
Yes.
And then in the I think it was the all new Super Friends hours when Zan and Jaina joined, and I was a little upset because I like Wendy and Marvin so much better. But my number 5, the Super Friends. It's not Super Friends, all one word. Super Friends.
Super Friends. And also, I just want to say one important thing to everybody listening out there. There are a lot of cynics in the world who will make fun of Black Vulcan and Samurai and Apache Chief and El Dorado. And I want you to know that I will come for you and I will hurt you, because those guys are amazing. And 55 years ago, Hanna-Barbera was willing to admit that maybe the Justice League had a diversity problem. And now, almost a lifetime later, DC Comics has still not fully admitted that.
Yeah, Black Vulcan and Apache Chief and Samurai, they all came out during the Challenge of the Super Friends.
Yeah, in
which
77,
also added,
78.
Yeah, which also added
Flash.
The Flash and Green Lantern and Hawkman to that group.
And the Atom actually did a few appearances too.
Yep.
And Green Arrow did at least one. Mm-hmm. I remember Green Arrow.
Rodrigo, what do you have for your number 4?
My number 4 is a cartoon from Japan.
No.
Ooh.
And
is it Samurai Pizza Cats?
It is not Samurai Pizza Cats. Samurai Pizza Cats certainly deserves to be in someone's top 5, and maybe if we were doing like a top 10, it would probably be in there. But for me as a kid, when I was living in Mexico, there was so first off, in other countries that aren't the United States, there isn't a tyrannical stranglehold on entertainment perpetrated through capitalism. In some other countries, that's the stranglehold is perpetrated by the government. But in Mexico, neither one of those really happens. Everybody's just kind of scrambling to try to make money off of stuff. So you get a lot of American entertainment, and you also get entertainment from other places without necessarily having to go to compete with American entertainment directly. Mm-hmm. So we got a lot of shows from Japan that either only made very limited TV time in the United States or didn't get shown on TV at all. And one of those shows is what here in the US is either called Saint Seiya or Knights of the Zodiac. Mm-hmm. And it was a very controversial show because it was very violent, and kids were so into it. It just made a huge splash back in like 1990 or whenever it came out.
Mm-hmm. Especially that Ted Cruz thing.
Yes.
That's yeah.
So if you look at it's interesting to see because it came out, like, seriously, this was a show that I think was made in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And eventually it got it actually made it to the US, and they made a big deal out of it because it's a very popular show in Japan. It's a very popular show in Latin America. And even in like 2000, when it finally made it to TV in the US, they couldn't show all the blood in the show. So it's like characters just like they would get punched and like green goop would come out. And like instead of having like red streaks down their clothing and like red bruising and stuff, it was like blue or like purple. Mm-hmm. So it just goes to show that the like looking back on it, I'm like, I'm sure the show wasn't that violent. And I look at it and it's like, maybe it was very violent for, a 5-year-old child to be watching, but man, was it cool. It was like guys had like cool armors, and the armors would be like, and they would like fly to them, and they would put them on like ching, 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 ching. And then they would be like, they were like armored martial artists. Also, all the characters were like these like very pretty boys. Mm-hmm. and it just like it's like, oh, I'm gonna put on my armor, and like the armor was like one, like sort of one chest part of a breastplate and like a shoulder pad, and then like a little like diadem or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, is that really armor? Is that really actually covering anything? So obviously, very, very influential in my art style nowadays, as I mostly just draw either shirtless guys or armored women. So yeah, my number 4, Knights of the Zodiac.
Very cool.
That really unlocks the secret of your art style for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like, no, that is definitely there.
My friends and I used to just sit and just draw the characters from the show and like make up our own characters and stuff like that. Like this show was formative to me.
All right, cool. Matthew, what do you have for your number 4?
My number 4 is one that you, my friend, have specifically poo-pooed in the past, and this is not because you poo-pooed it.
Why did I poo-poo it?
You said that it's not as good as an earlier version of the franchise, but okay. I will make the argument, and I will make the argument for you right now for my number 4, the new Scooby-Doo movies, which is the second iteration of Scooby-Doo. The original iteration of Scooby-Doo was Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? From like 1969. And much as with Space Ghost, there were 24 episodes, and they aired for 25 years.
Yep.
But in 1972, they relaunched Scooby-Doo in hour-long episodes. And when I was seeing these, they were playing them in the hour-long episodes, although a lot of times we would also catch them in syndication broken in 2. And the thing about it is it still has the original voice cast. So you got your Casey Kasem, you got your Frank Welker. You know, you've got the characters all there. You've got Heather North still playing Daphne, and Heather is the definitive Daphne. But it also has special guests. There's an episode where they go and meet the Addams family. There's an episode where they meet Phyllis Diller. There's an episode where they meet the Three Stooges. And of course, this all takes place in Scooby-Doo, which means that all of these people are working as janitors or high school football coaches or doing things because, again, in Scooby-Doo, you may not know this, but the economy and everything has collapsed and people are forced to do whatever they can to get by. And there's an episode where they meet Davy Jones, and Davy Jones, of course, is running a castle in the Scottish countryside for reasons which remain unknown. And it's weird. It is super weird. And I will agree with you.
They met Batman and Robin. They met Don Knotts. They met
Jerry Reed. There's a whole Jerry Reed episode.
Sonny and Cher.
Mm-hmm.
They're the worst. Sorry.
No, they're not the worst. They are not as good.
Oh, right.
As the
Scrappy-Doo. Scrappy-Doo comes in later after that. So, yes, the Scrappy-Doo adventures, much worse than the Let's Meet a Guest Host episode of Scooby-Doo.
They are fascinating, and they are amazing to look at. And there's an episode where we discover that Sandy Duncan looks just like Daphne if you put her in a red wig.
Yep.
And it's really fascinating to see it because it is a very early example of kind of a franchising, a merchandising take, and how can we really change this and make it different? You know, like later we'd get the Brady Bunch Variety Hour. Weird crap like this would happen, but Scooby-Doo did it in such a way that it didn't destroy, it didn't break their format. It was still 5 kids traveling the country, figuring out that it was always, you know, real estate developers wearing masks pretending to be ghosts. And the Scooby-Doo movies are really, really good. They are better animated, physically speaking, you know, from a mechanical perspective. They're better animated than the Scooby-Doo Where Are You episode.
Well, yeah, because they're a couple of years later.
Well, I'm just saying. And if you go into it from the perspective that I did, which is, man, this is goofy, can I have some fun with this? Absolutely. I recommend these to you. I actually would recommend that you watch the original Scooby-Doo run and this and then stop. You don't want to get into the scrappy days.
You know, I'll agree with you, Matt. There was some fun bits about watching the Scooby-Doo movies and
13
saying
Ghosts gives us flim flam, and that's just
there is something about watching those Scooby-Doo movies and being able to sit there and go, okay, who's going to be the guest this week? Because they'd always introduce it right at the top, right after the credits rolled, and it said, this week, they meet Batman and Robin. Yeah. You're like, yeah, because that's the one that you waited around for. And instead,
And
we
it
were
would be
always
like
getting
a
the
member.
stupid Don Knotts one or the Don Adams one over and over again.
Or the one with the Stooges, and you'd have it was not classic Stooges either. It was Larry Moe and Joe Besser.
It was like Larry and Curly Joe. Oh, I guess Moe was in that one too. But,
and I mean, you can't hate the fact that they're interacting with the Addams family, and the whole explicit premise of Scooby-Doo is disproving the supernatural.
Right, exactly.
And the premise of the Addams family is mom may be a vampire.
Yeah.
Actually, I may be thinking of the Munsters. But yeah, it's wonderful. And they cross over with Batman.
Yeah, they do. More than once.
The real Batman. The actual Batman, Ulan Sewell, the real Batman, as I like to call him.
Yes,
voiced, and of course, with Casey Kasem as Robin. Mm-hmm. That is my Batman. That's my first Batman.
Yeah, because it's really weird because Casey Kasem is doing Shaggy and Robin at the same time.
Well, Casey's a professional. Casey will just go.
There's no way that those two sound anything alike until you watch the show and go, why do those two sound so much alike?
And you're like, holy crap. Yeah, and, Don Messick. You got your Don Messick. You got your Frank Welker. Are you maying Don Messick?
No, I'm just the new Scooby-Doo movies. I mean, you're right. It's better than anything that came after the new Scooby-Doo movies. But compared to the original Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? It's just I don't know. It just feels watered down. And
it's a hat on a hat, but I actually appreciate a hat on a hat. And maybe it's the fact that it is a little bit of overkill. And it is kind of a...
So here's why it's so much overkill. And I know we're using up a lot of time here, but it's like... Cool. We're going to pull into this town. Here's a gas station. Oh, who's coming out? Don Knotts. Hey there, kids. What are you guys doing? Don Knotts, what are you doing in this show? And every time they have to refer to these characters, every time that they talk to these characters, it's just like, gee, Phyllis Diller, or gee, Sandy Duncan, or gee, Dick Van Dyke. They never just say gee, Dick, or gee, Sandy.
Track.
They got to keep reiterating their name over and over again. That's what made it so felt out of place, because that's not how you do it. It's not like you suddenly turn around and go, oh, it's Weird Al Yankovic, who came in the new Scooby-Doo updated movies or whatever it is.
That's what.
Oh, it's John Cena.
Da, 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 da.
I don't know. It's ridiculous.
Thanks, John Cena. But you know what? It's my number 4. I love it. I recommend it. And it has a better theme song.
I have to go back and double check, but I'm going to probably disagree with you on that.
My list, my rules.
Of course it is. Number 4 for me is one that has a lot of music in it. Mm-hmm. It's one that teaches you a lot about history and language and cool stuff, science and math. And it's one that even today still gets mentioned very regularly in this house. And in fact, I think the debut, as of this recording, the debut of the very first Schoolhouse Rock happened just a few days ago. 50 years ago, which is a few days ago, or not really 50 years ago. But the history of Schoolhouse Rock is really kind of incredible and really kind of brilliant, because FCC says there has to be a certain amount of programming that is educational. And so at the time, head of ABC, who then went over to Disney, what's his name? Michael Eisner. I think that's his name, right? Sat down and he was like, look, how about we create this series of little cartoons, 2 or 3 minutes long, that teaches kids something. We can use this as our educational write-off for the FCC, and everyone will be fine with it. And they have some great music. They have some animation that's pretty typical of the early 1970s.
Yeah, the animation's pretty bad, but
what they didn't expect,
not that bad.
What they didn't expect was for these to take off and be immensely popular.
Huge.
So much so that today, anytime someone mentions how a bill, if someone asks, how does a bill get through Congress? How is a bill written into law? And everybody will just start I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill.
To
and
this
I'm
day,
sitting here on Capitol Hill.
To this day, some poor guy on SNL gets dressed up and does that bit whenever there's some sort of congressional issue.
I'm an executive.
Kenan Thompson's the bill right now.
Interplanet Janet, My Hero Zero is probably my favorite, although it'd probably be My Hero Zero followed by Lolly Lolly Lolly.
Adverbs.
Yeah, the adverb song and
Verb.
What is the one?
Verb.
What is the one that is the camping trip one?
That is unpack your adjectives.
Adjectives. That's those are probably my top 3, and Bill would be number 4.
Bill is up there. This is actually my number 3.
All right, cool. Why do you have it as your number 3?
Well, there's 2 reasons, actually. I was recently, as of this recording, was recently reminded of the existence of this show when Bob Doro, one of the founding guys of this, passed away. And Bob Doro is the guy who sings 3 is a magic number.
Oh, 3 is a magic number. Bob Doro is the guy who did
the 5, 10, 15, 20, 25.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Doro just recently passed away, and I was thinking about this. My kid is 14 now.
Right.
When she was little, we got her the DVD of Schoolhouse Rock. And she actually got in trouble once because she was used to saying she wanted to watch all of them and let them play. And apparently she asked her Aunt Deidre, and she was like, do you want 1 or 2? And she's like, I want all of them. And she got in trouble and didn't get to watch any. But the thing about the Schoolhouse Rock, it was 1973, 1974. Yeah. We were watching this stuff has aged. The animation hasn't, obviously, but the actual material has aged incredibly well.
Oh, yeah,
Even things out of date are still catchy as hell and still fascinating. And they actually came back for a new round of them in like the 90s.
Yeah, the 90s. They not only did they create some new ones, but then they went and had a bunch of popular artists at the time go in and re-record the songs into a modern take of it. I've got that album somewhere around. But I mean, and those are good. They're not as good as the originals though. And I was able to pull out My Hero Zero the other day. Well, actually it wasn't a day ago. It was about a year ago for my youngest when he was trying to figure out multiplication. And it's like, hey, you know how great 0 is and how you can multiply by 10? And he's like, no. And I was like, let's watch My Hero Zero. And after that, he's like, oh, I can multiply by 10. That's easy.
Yep. Verb is one of my absolute favorites, possibly because it stars a superhero, but it is incredibly useful to remember when you're trying to explain to your children parts of speech. And you're like, okay, how does grammar work? And then you remember
she gets up in the morning and walks around and makes my breakfast.
That's what happened. That's what's happening.
Yep.
But oh my God, I love all of these. And even the ones where you go and you watch them, you're like, man, that animation is awful.
Oh yeah, and it is really. I mean, they had to do it on a cheap budget, and Eisner, I believe, was in charge of doing all of them. But he got one of the guys who was working over at, was it Electric Company or Sesame Street, who did those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. One of those guys.
11, 12.
Yeah, he got one of those guys to do the animation on it. And it is just, I mean, it's super cheap for the time. I mean, it's just literally a still image until you need something to move, and then something will move.
But that I think is part of what makes the iconography so memorable is, you have these breakdowns. If I say to you right now, Conjunction Junction, you're picturing the little bald guy in the cap. You're seeing him doing this stuff, and that's what works for me. To this day, if you ask my wife how the preamble to the Constitution of the United States goes, she has to sing it to remember it.
I keep forgetting all these great ones.
Yeah. And the thing that's really great is by the time you and I were starting to watch these, Interplanet Janet was actually some of the last round. That came out in like 79.
Yeah. And you say when you and I were beginning to watch this. No, when Schoolhouse Rock started, I was watching that.
You say that.
No, I do say that. You can ask my mom. In fact, almost all of these, there are only 2 on my list that do not come from the time that I lived in my very first house of my top 5. But all of them come from, and my mom she'll raise her hand and say, yeah, we watched the Saturday morning cartoons and all of that stuff. And we moved when I was in 74, 70. No, it wouldn't have been 75. It would have been 74. So yeah, I would have watched that stuff at the old house on black and white TV.
Okay. My name is Rufus Xavier Sasparilla.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I love that one because we got pronouns. Saying all those nouns over and over can really wear you down.
Yep. I'm gonna have
and
to
it also gives me the line that I repeat relatively often during our shows. Who brought that rhinoceros on this bus?
Yep. So there you go. There's my number 4 and Matthew's number 3, Schoolhouse Rock or Schoolhouse Rocky. It's a chip off the block.
Because he lives at a schoolhouse.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Ba-da-da.
Rodrigo, what do you have for, let's see. we've done everybody's 4s, right, Matthew? Yeah, okay. Rodrigo, what do you have for number 3?
My number 3, and by the way, I was in Schoolhouse Rock Live in high school.
I remember that.
Did you play a Bill?
No,
the teacher guy, right?
Yep. So the vehicle for that show is that there's a teacher getting ready for his first day of school and he's nervous. So he puts on Schoolhouse Rock. That's the character also who sings the least, which is why I got cast as that. Yeah. So it was the lead, but he also does the least amount of singing. But I did do Rufus, Xavier, Sasparilla.
That's a good one.
So there was that.
And we're so happy.
Yep.
Because we got pronouns.
So also, my number 3, not from the time when I was doing Schoolhouse Rock over and over again, but much earlier is, you guys remember a show called Thundercats?
Oh, I do remember Thundercats.
Thunder.
It's like Thundercats is a pretty interesting show in the sense that it really wears its influences pretty broadly. You know, it's like, first off, it's the 80s, so everything's kind of like shiny space metal, right? Also, the main character has a magical growing sword and a ghostly mentor. And also, nobody wears pants like Conan. I was going to be more oblique about that one, but it's true. So the Thundercats was something that I was watching when I was pretty young, and it's something that's really impacted me. And unlike some other cartoons that I've gone back and I watch and I'm like, yeah, no, this was cool. Like Thundercats just kind of does not hold up. And I think a big part of it is just what a colossal discrepancy there is between the intro and the actual and the quality of animation of the actual show. And it's like, I get it. You want that intro to hook people in and be like, oh my God, this is amazing. But then it's just like such a downer when you go from that to like just barely above C-Lab level animation. And it was all over the place. Some episodes are really good at animation. Some episodes, like, you're like, did the show actually stop? And it's like, no, they just had like a particularly long freeze frame because it's like, we can't afford to put another frame into this kind of stuff. But it was super cool. And, you know, growing up with it, it was really fun. You know, it's like a bunch of cat people, sort of. They don't really look like cats that much. Chitara was probably my first like cartoon crush. I was like, that lady looks good. She's always in a one-piece bathing suit because, you know, it's Conan and nobody wears pants. So yeah, my number 3 is Thundercats.
Very cool. Matthew, we've already done your number 3. My number 3 and my number 2 both are kind of at the tail end of when I was watching cartoons as a kid before I was told, hey, stop watching cartoons on Saturday morning. You got stuffs to do. And my number 3 is a Marvel property that features Iceman and Firestar and the little dog. Was it
Ms. Lion?
Ms. Lion. And of course, Spider-Man. Spider-Man and his amazing friends ran from 1981 until 1983, and then it went into reruns from 84 to 86. But whenever you hear Matthew and I talk about Swarm, or you hear us talk about, flipping the little lever to turn our bedroom into a sciencey lab, and where does all the sciencey lab stuff go to, including all those beakers that are bubbling, we're referencing Spider-Man and his amazing friends. Now, again, it wasn't great animation. In fact, a lot of it was recycled again and again and again, especially when Iceman and Firestar did their transformations, which was, roughly a third of every episode.
Yep.
But it was really good. I really enjoyed that. I want to say, besides Super Friends, this would have been my first real foray into Marvel Comics superheroes at the time. And NBC made a big deal of this. I mean, there was the Spider-Man series that came before this. I don't remember that one for some reason. But
it wasn't
Spider-Man,
very good. It wasn't on for very long, actually.
Yeah, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. When they added Iceman and Firestar in there, and they started out with, a bee-man, a meteor turning into a bee-man and everything. Oh, man, that was stuff to be watching. And it was great. They
fought Dracula.
They did.
Probably at some point,
the second best X-Man of all time, Video Man.
Yeah.
Video Man joined the X-Men, my friends. He is canonically an X-Man on Earth 83109.
Yep. But man, I really enjoyed the heck out of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. It was fun. And like I said, it ran into about 83. And about that time it was, hey man, and it was on late enough in the morning. I want to say Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends would have been on right about the time you switched over from the animated stuff into like, what's the show with Zach and Screech and all of that?
Saved by the Bell.
Saved by the Bell. Right about that time you would transition into the live action kids series. And that was the time when it's like, it's like 10 o'clock. You better turn off the TV. It's time to get to work.
Yeah. Well, your 7 a.m. hour was always the Smurfs.
Yeah, Smurfs and Gummy Bears. You
had like Snorks, which were underground Smurfs.
Mm-hmm. Underwater Smurfs.
Saved by the Bell was a few years later.
Yeah, it may have been. I just remember that's about the time that you transition into the live action stuff. And while I was already up for my day and going through all of the stuff, and I wasn't interested in the Pac-Man hour, the Mario hour, or anything like that. I was watching Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. I know. I remember watching it, but at that time I'm like starting to do more things like, hey, you got chores and responsibilities, and you've got friends to hang out with, and you've got basketball Saturday morning basketball camp and all these other things that are going on when you're in middle school. So Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends kind of heralds kind of the end of me watching Saturday morning cartoons. I've got some almost rans that pick up later, well later into college. But Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, such a great show. So that is my number 3. We are up to our number 2. And Rodrigo, what do you have for number 2?
My number 2 is also a Marvel property. And as I mentioned before, my mom didn't want us watching TV all day. And this one came on kind of late on Saturday mornings. And I would fight to be able to watch this. I think that maybe just because of that, it's like one of the cartoons with like a strongest emotional reaction for me, just because I had to fight so hard to actually watch it. And of course, this was before TV on demand and before TiVo. And anyway, my parents weren't going to spend money on that stuff. So, and they didn't want me tying up the TV and VCR or whatever and like taping it. So, the 90s X-Men was a point of contention in my house, but also just such a great moment in television history. Because who doesn't like to watch like the Beast jumping around with like a backpack and shooting a pink laser and stuff? And it's like it did a lot to condense sort of like major X-Men storylines into pretty digestible stuff. In I don't know, it might be just kind of me being nostalgic about it, but I think it did it in a really good way and a lot better ways that other stuff has done it. I feel like some other stuff really trips up all over the Dark Phoenix saga, and it trips up over the
pronunciation
Days of
Megatron.
Future Past, and all the X-Men time travel stuff. And I just thought the 90s cartoon really executed it really well. It also gave us Jubilee as a character that people know.
That X-Men was my almost ran because it was one that started when I was in college. And Saturday morning, if I was awake at the time, and I'd stumble out, and just before my friends would come over and we would watch MST3K from the night before, X-Men was on. And so we would watch X-Men and get into that. And I liked it because you're right, Rodrigo. It did condense a lot of the stories into something that people could understand, so that if they did venture out to a comic book shop and did see a trade paperback from 20 years ago, they would know what that story would be and would then pick it up. The same is true. I was going to say the same is true for that Spider-Man syndicated series that ran. Was it just called The Amazing Spider-Man?
I think it. Yeah, maybe it was Amazing Spider-Man.
It ran in like the late '80s and early '90s. Do you remember what that one was called, Matthew?
I think it was just Spider-Man.
Oh, okay, Spider-Man. Okay, that one kind of did the same thing.
Spider-Man. It was on Fox.
Yes, it was on Fox. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. So cool. What were you going to say? Following up on what I was saying
about Spider-Man?
Yeah, about X-Men or Spider-Man.
Yeah, that Spider-Man cartoon I think is actually by the same company or group. So it really took a lot of what the X-Men were doing and really just followed that up really well into. Weirdly, I feel like the X-Men cartoon was doing really classic X-Men storylines, and the Spider-Man cartoon was like, let's do the weird ones.
Oh yeah, because you had Morbius, you had the
let's do Morbius, let's do the Spider Slayers, let's do like
they did a take on Secret Wars.
Yeah,
what's the one where Spider-Man gets the 6 arms?
That is 6-armed Spider-Man. Spider-Man number 100.
Yeah. Let's do Mutant Spider-Man. That's one of the first storylines they did.
Yep. Yeah. Neat. Matthew, what do you have for your number 2?
My number 2 is a DC property because I'm a contrarian by nature. That's not true. I didn't know what was on your list, but it is only sort of a DC property in that there was only sort of a DC presence on television other than Super Friends. But it is one of the formative series for me because it featured 3 important bits that I really, really now find myself gravitating to over and over and over in comic book and superhero type stories. It featured kid superheroes learning how to be superheroes. It featured at least one fat guy. And it featured Captain Fricking Marvel. And of course, I'm referring to 1981, actually. The Kids Superpower Hour, with Shazam. Featuring the first segment was Hero High, which was a high school for superheroes, which, when you think about it, kind of makes sense with a title like that. And that show featured a lot of fascinating characters, including one who was named, and I love this name, Rex Ruthless, who was sort of an aspiring supervillain, but since it was high school, he was basically the Reggie Mantle character. In a lot of ways, Hero High was Archie with costumes. And I think it may have been created as Archie with costumes, to be honest, because if you look at the archetypes in play, they are definitely the archetypes of Archie comics. But it also has the moments where, first of all, it's a Filmation cartoon. And we talked about limited animation in a Hanna-Barbera.
Oh, man.
Hanna-Barbera limited animation makes Filmation look like, I don't know, freezing chickens, just still photos of a field from a Pearl Jam record in 1998. And yet I am going to stand up and I'm going to say to you, I love my Filmation, guys. I do, because this show got by on pure chutzpah and charisma and other things that start with a CH, because it wasn't well animated. It wasn't well written, but man, it was incredibly enthusiastic. And as with all Filmation properties, the limited animation did not include the run cycles, which is when your characters move across the screen, because they animated those run cycles at full frame and just used them over and over and over. So those were the only thing in the show that you could count on being well animated, because they did those at the beginning. Then they used them like 9 times in every episode. But they were just really fluid and really bizarre. And then you'd cut back to, frozen faces with almost clutch cargo mouths. But it had Captain Marvel Jr., who is a fave-rave of mine now because of this show. It made very good use of Mary Marvel, which I think is something that a lot of even modern stories can't quite get a grasp on. Why do we want a teenage girl superhero who's not like super sexy or evil or super evil sexy? And the answer is, shut up, it's Mary Marvel. What are you, stupid? But if you ever get a chance to watch the Kids Superpower Hour with Shazam, you're going to look at it and go, you seriously love this? And I'm going to say to you, yes. Yes, I did.
This was at the same time. Wasn't Filmation having like a big resurgence or something, because there was like a new Mighty Mouse that I believe was Filmation, and the new Popeye.
The Mighty Mouse was Ralph Bakshi.
Okay, and then there was also like a Popeye one, and these all came out. I want to say those were all CBS stuffs, weren't they?
Yeah, 80, 81. They had a lot of... The thing about Filmation is they never really went away until they completely went away.
Yeah.
Because they started in, like 1970 something. But they did... Filmation did the Superman Batman Hour.
Mm-hmm.
Filmation did Tarzan and the Super 7. Filmation, of course, did all of the Archie stuff. They did He-Man and She-Ra later on. They did Brave Star. But when they finally went down, they were just all of a sudden gone.
Yeah.
But Filmation was one of those things where you'd see them, over and over and over. And you can always tell a Filmation property because the head creators didn't want to, they argued over who should get top billing. So instead of top billing, they had a circle that would rotate with the producers' names. With Lou Schemer and Norm Prescott, so that nobody got top billing, but you could always tell a Filmation show because you'd see that rotating circle and you'd go like, oh, that's clever. And what it really turned out was, Lou and Norm were arguing over who should get top billing, and nobody was going to back down.
So this only ran for one season. And for some reason, I have no recollection of this. And I have a feeling I know why. Because growing up,
you didn't have cable.
Well, number one, no, this was an NBC show.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, as a kid, VCRs were not super common in a lot of households. I think we got our VCR in like 1980, 81, somewhere around there. No, it would have been like an 82. And so being able to record another cartoon show was, rare, but there was no way you could record multiple shows. So what you ended up having to do was flip over to a channel. What's coming up next? Oh, it's this show. I've already seen this one, or I'm not interested in Bugs Bunny and Looney Tunes again, or whatever. And so you'd flip the channel to, ABC and see what Mario or Pac-Man was doing. And then you'd flip over to another one. And so you were constantly flipping back and forth, trying to find the right show. And that, I think, is how I discovered, or how I ended up getting the very last cartoon show that I watched as a kid was Dungeons and Dragons, because it ran, I believe, at the exact same time as Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. And so I'd flip over to Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, see what that story was. And then if that was a rerun, I'd flip it over to Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons tells us this story about a group of kids that get on this roller coaster ride at an amusement park, and they find themselves in the world of the TSR's Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game, with a little Yoda character named, what was his name? Wasn't it Dungeon Master? Yeah, his name was Dungeon Master. And they'd fight Tiamat. They'd fight this, what was the other dude's name? Venger, yeah. And it was really, really cool. I really got into that high fantasy kind of stuff that was going on. They all had magical weapons. They all took on the different roles that you would find in the game. There was a little magical unicorn baby that the little the barbarian kid would have. But I thought it was really cool. And again, the animation isn't great. Saturday morning cartoon animation is never really great. Unless you're doing some Don Bluth show that was on.
Right.
Those were rare. Unfortunately, I did get that Dungeons and Dragons DVD re-release a few years ago and watched a couple of episodes, and they just weren't that good. But
no. There's like 25 episodes.
Yeah, Dungeons and Dragons ran from 83 to 85. So it was right at the end of Amazing Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and they were doing the reruns on that. So it was easy to flip back and forth. But I don't think I ever saw the final seasons of Dungeons and Dragons, because that would have come out when I was in high school. And it was definitely, you're doing work all the time, nonstop every weekend. So I never really got to see that much Dungeons and Dragons. Sometimes I'd come in and my sister would be watching part of it or flipping through stuff. But for the most part, my Saturday morning cartoon viewing as a kid ended with Dungeons and Dragons.
See, mine ended with a show after that, the cartoon animation of the Dukes of Hazzard.
Oh, see, I didn't even know there was one of those.
Oh, it was awful. God awful. Never, ever watch it.
Yeah. No, I probably never ever will. So there you go. There's my number 2, Dungeons and Dragons. All right. We've gone through 5, 4, 3, and 2, which brings us to our number 1 Saturday morning cartoon. And Rodrigo, what have you got for us?
Is it the Monchichis? It's the Monchichis.
Oh my goodness. I got a Monchichi story to tell you guys after we're done recording this.
It is not the Monchichis, but
is it the Shirt Tails?
You know, funny story about the Monchichis, since we're here. In Spanish, the word, or in Mexico, the word chichi means something else. So in Mexico, they were called the Monquiquis. Because otherwise people would think that it was something else.
Yeah, and if you want to know what else, sign up for our major spoilers after dark.
Actually, they could just go into a Google Translate.
Yeah, don't do it while your parents are watching.
Google Translate won't tell you.
So my number 1 also comes directly from this necessity to wake up super early and watch cartoons. This cartoon was on really early, and it was actually really early on weekdays as well. I don't remember exactly when it started airing on weekdays, but when I found out that it did, I started getting up like 2 hours earlier than I had to from school, because I just loved this show so much. It's a show that I think was kind of maligned by the fans of the original work when it first came out, but has since kind of come around and become sort of been accepted and embraced by the community as a whole, which is good, because I would stand on this hill and fight to the death to defend this show, and that's Beast Wars, aka Transformers.
Oh yeah,
Beast
that was
Wars.
the 3D thing, right?
Yep. So it was computer generated Transformers. Possibly the first time we got actual computer generated Transformers. The storyline is that a bunch of Transformers from the future of your Optimus Prime and whatever get sent back to primitive Earth and have to make their way there, and their advanced technology allows them to copy indigenous life forms. So you have Optimus, obviously, because every franchise turns into a family affair. You have Optimus Prime's, great grand robot son, I guess. Optimus Primal.
So they should have gone with Optimus because he's a gorilla.
They should have gone with what?
Optimus Primate.
Yeah. Well, I think they thought that maybe that was too on the nose. And then, of course, Megatron's future kid, Megatron. Because Megatron's not joking around. It's like people are like, oh, how about we call this one Optimus? We call him like T-Rexatron. And Megatron's like, no, I'm Megatron, okay? The bad guy of the show is called Megatron. I'm just going to be Megatron. But yeah, so, when people are like, my doctor wears a fez. Like for me, it's like, my Megatron is a purple T-Rex. Voiced by David Kaye. Great work. Very, very threatening and weirdly funny. Very, very good. Classic villain voice work there. And yeah, I mean, for years I followed that show, just working really hard to piece it together, because of course I think it was in syndication immediately, and shows aired out of order and shows just didn't air. So maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I actually sat down and tracked down every episode. So I watched every episode of Beast Wars and every episode of the ensuing and much more maligned Beast Machines, which was not well received, but honestly is not that bad. It does a lot of interesting things with the characters themselves, and I really appreciate it. So it's like people were like, well, this is really different, and the Transformers kind of magically turn back and forth into things instead of actually and a lot of people got off the train right there. But if you were following the characters from Transformers or from Beast Wars, Beast Machines really does put a neat little bow on the series. So yeah, my number one, robots in disguise as rats, apparently Beast Wars.
You know, the thing that I remember about Beast Wars, and I'm not sure how much of this story is legit. Do you know Waspinator?
Yeah.
You know that he's striped like a bumblebee?
Mm-hmm.
You know why he's not called Bumblebee?
Why? Because Transformer?
Theoretically, at one point, the claim was, and I don't know the veracity of this, was that he was going to be called Bumblebee, but Hasbro was told that the trademark for a robot that turns into a car named Bumblebee was solid, and they could do that. But having him physically be a Bumblebee and be named Bumblebee was not as defensible or strong a trademark, and they didn't get away with it.
That's interesting. Well, I mean, one of the protagonists, potentially the best character in this entire show, was just named Dinobot, which, you know, as a kid, I was already familiar with Transformers, and they're like, here's this character named Dinobot. And I was like, well, if this takes place in the future, I guess it's like being called Norman.
Yep.
Now that I think of it, it's like, I guess that's okay, right? It's like people are called like Herman and stuff like that. It's like, you know, Frank.
Ted.
All right, sure. Dinobot. Why not?
Or having the last name Farmer.
Yeah, sure.
And being a farmer.
Maybe it's not as crazy as I thought.
Yeah, it happens.
Matthew, what do you have for your number one?
My number one. First of all, I'm here again, and I want to say to you, this is another Filmation joint. And that's because I'm old, partly. Stephen and I, again, we're talking about shows that came out in the 70s and to some degree the early 80s. But mostly it's just because I'm old, but also because this was, and this is head and shoulders above, this is the crown jewel of the Filmation library. This is the top dog, El Bonzo Seiko. You cannot beat this in Filmation. And you can tell me, oh, He-Man was good. You can tell me Brave Star was creative. You can tell me Jason of Star Command was 12 episodes long. But I will tell you that none of them will ever match Filmation's greatest achievement, their pièce de résistance, their fromage con queso, Star Trek, the animated series from 1973. Now, again, I wasn't watching it in 1973, but I did watch it because it was in syndication all the way through, and it came back in 79 when they did Star Trek, the Motionless Picture. But the thing about Star Trek, the animated series that is wonderful is, unlike most animated adaptations, they brought back nearly the entire original voice cast. Chekhov, Walter Koenig, did not come back. Everyone else did. They got Shatner, they got Nimoy, they got Dee Kelly, they got James Doohan, they got Nichelle Nichols. And the wonderful part was, because they had James Doohan and because they had Majel Barrett, both of whom are very skilled voice actors, they had literally an entire army of alternate voices. And since both of those characters, when they're playing their Star Trek characters, aren't using their actual voice, they're using an affectation voice, or in Scotty's case, an accent, you didn't necessarily know that you were listening to James Doohan talking to James Doohan, arguing about whether or not James Doohan was James Doohan. Mm-hmm. This show was on for, I think, 2 seasons, maybe 25 episodes. But they were all really solid. They weren't necessarily up to the standards of some of the best of the original Trek. I will grant you that. But on Saturday morning, these things were practically Shakespeare. And there's a couple of episodes where Larry Niven writes episodes that bring in his Kazin characters from his book series. And I'm like, oh my God, that is so awesome. I love these guys. And then I went to read the book and I'm like, oh, I don't love these guys nearly as much. But the thing about this that's wonderful is, for years and years, they were like, oh, these are really great. Are these canon? And, you know, the official answer from Paramount was nope. And then at one point, somebody referenced part of a story in one episode, and it was canonically referenced, the episode Yesteryear, where Spock had to go back in time to keep himself from dying back in the day because of a manipulation of the Guardian of Forever. And somebody referenced that. And I'm like, oh, well, that references that episode that somebody knew happened. And then Paramount and somebody's like, okay, that episode's canon. But the last that I heard, and it may just be a shrug of who cares, we've rebooted the universe, but the last I've heard, they have now said, yeah, the animated series is totally canonical. Those missions happened, which is great because Star Trek was on for 3 seasons, 5-year mission, 2 seasons of this original series, or 2 seasons of this animated series on top of Star Trek, the original series, and I have my 5-year mission. So it not only appeals to the science fiction fan in me, it appeals to the completist in me. And it appeals to anybody who wants to listen to some really interesting voice acting. Now, granted, it does have Klingons in pink suits. I mean, my daughter was asking me why the Klingons are wearing pink. That's coloring. It's a thing that happens. But it features sequels to things like The Trouble with Tribbles. It features callbacks to the stories that we saw. It features actual continuity. It features some really interesting drama. And, you know, if I were to put it up there, it's in my top 5 Treks. It's right after Deep Space Nine and the original series, and right above everything but season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. I mean, if you want to see what animation could really have been if people went in and treated it the same way they treated an hour-long drama series, you need to look no further than Filmation's Star Trek from 1973, man.
Yeah.
It's good stuff.
Chekhov actually wrote one of those episodes.
Yes.
In it.
And the way I understand it is that may have been kind of a little bone thrown to him because they couldn't afford him on the voice cast.
Yeah. Also, if I'm not mistaken, and this is the reason why I liked Star Trek the Animated Series, was because it featured a diverse crew of aliens.
Yes.
That were
Lieutenant
on like
Maress.
Yeah, who were actually on the bridge all the time.
Yep.
And, you know, that's something that is totally wild and, you know, doesn't seem right until you get into, I can't remember if it was a Voyager or forget which series it is, but they make reference to having a bunch of aliens on the bridge to kind of say, hey, yes, I know humans, et cetera, but, you know, we can have alien crew members that look drastically different than anything you've seen before. So
Lieutenant Eric's is a 3-armed guy who looks a little bit like E.T.'s big brother.
Mm-hmm.
But if you actually, the most wonderful part about Eric's for me is that he is this weird 3-armed, gangly purple alien, but he's wearing a gold command shirt.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got 3 sleeves, but it's the same damn shirt that Kirk is wearing. It's the same damn shirt that Sulu is wearing. And it's, you know, strung over this really cool alien form. So yeah, that is a good call. I didn't even think about Eric's.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. We are to my number 1, and my number 1, unfortunately, in today's world is now somewhat problematic. And that's only because of the show's creator, Bill Cosby.
Ooh.
At one point, before Bill Cosby became a horrible lech and rapist and all these other things that he's being accused of, he was actually quite funny. And his humor still stands up as some of the best humor that you will ever hear. And in his 1967 album called Revenge, he told the story of a game they used to play as kids in Philadelphia called Buck Buck, where you all line up, you bend over, you grab each other, and then you take turns. Each team takes turns running and jumping onto the line of kids trying to break them. And, you know, whoever broke, of course, was the losers. But, of course, Cosby's team always wins because they had Big Old Fat Albert. And that was his name, Big Old Fat Albert, in the album. And it's great. And if you ever listen to Cosby do his Fat Albert routines, there's at least 2 of them. They're brilliant. But then people were like, these stories you have about your childhood seems like a great way to get into children's television programming. And so in, I want to say 1973, 72, somewhere around there, 72, I think, Bill Cosby launched a show called Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids. And the best part about Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids is here are a bunch of kids that are, for the most part, underprivileged. They are a group of, in a minority class, something that you typically do not see on television. And these shows were awesome because they showed struggles that these inner city kids had to go through, and they would teach you life lessons that would then flip around and have an overall message in the story. It doesn't matter, like stealing is bad. Don't get into cars with strangers. Don't do drugs. Don't, just all these kind of messages. And intercut with the animated parts, Bill Cosby, who at the time had this crazy mustache and mutton chop thing going on, would come in and he would address the kids saying, oh, it looks like the kids are not listening right. This is not a right thing. Let's see what happens next. And then he'd throw back to the cartoon show. And then at the end, he would come in and he'd give a summary of what you saw and what you were supposed to learn. And then it always ended with a musical number of the kids in a junkyard playing musical instruments that they cobbled together from all the junk. And it was
except for Rudy, who had an electric guitar.
Yeah, except for Rudy, who had an electric guitar, because Rudy. Right. That's not. No, not. Is it Rudy? Yeah,
it is Rudy.
Yeah.
Rudy had the cool hat.
Yep. Yeah, Rudy was the one that got into the most trouble. He would be the Reggie of the group if this were the Archie kids. But this was such a really good program. And it was, and as I remember as a kid, really young, this would be one of the last shows that I would watch at 3 or 4 years old, because my mom would say, okay, after the Cosby show's over, it's time to turn it off and we're going to go and do things. And I remember she'd sit and watch Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids with me, and then we'd talk about some of the things that were going on. So beyond being educational, beyond being funny, beyond being somewhat groundbreaking, especially in the early years, because as it got on, then you got in the Brown Hornet and some other craziness that was introduced.
I kind of loved the Brown Hornet.
Yeah, that came out like in I want to say the mid to late 70s, early 80s, because this show ran until 85.
Yeah, the Brown Hornet was like 83.
Yeah, this stuff ran, over a decade. It's probably won many awards because of the messages that it was bringing and that it was educational. In fact, it was supposed to be originally, I think, at NBC, and they were like, nah, this is too educational for us. And so then they just went over to CBS and they did it over there.
You know who did that?
Who was that?
Filmation.
Yeah, Filmation did the animation on that. That's right.
I just found a graphic of Verb versus the Brown Hornet.
There you go.
You got to share that with me, man. I want to keep that.
Yeah, I'll send you the link.
The Brown Hornet. I mean, so I know, and the problem is, Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids is such a fantastic show. It has such a fantastic message, and it comes from a place of fantastic humor. The unfortunate part is everything that Bill Cosby has ever touched is now soiled, at least in my mind. And I know that there's this question of separating the art from the artist, but man, it is really tough right now when you sit down and you want to have your kids watch Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, because at one point it was on Netflix streaming the entire series, and my kids were watching parts of it. But unfortunately, it's spoiled.
It's tough.
It's got a stink to it now, and I don't know, if we can ever overcome that. But up until a few years ago, Fat Albert and Cosby Kids is the pinnacle of Saturday morning cartoons, because it had everything that you needed in it. It had fun times, it had antics, it had laughter, it had a lesson to be learned, and so. That's why it's my number one.
You might learn something before it's done. You
know what I'm saying? Hey. Just such a great show. And that's why it's my number one, even though it's somewhat spoiled now.
It's tough. I mean, I had a 10 things category where I'm like, who would be perfect for this? The Brown Hornet. Oh, yeah. And I argued with myself, can I? And I came to the decision that no, I could not. But yeah, it's one of those things where I don't think it's ever going to be quite the same as it was.
No, it won't.
It might be, but it's going to take a long time. I mean, eventually Bill Cosby's going to die, and then we'll kind of go through this process of of beautification and glorifying and whatever. It happens all the time. And eventually people will say something like, hey, check out this Fat Albert cartoon done by, entertainer Bill Cosby, who had a very complex blah, blah, blah. Like, eventually it won't be so recent, but we might be way too old by that point.
Oh, yeah. I actually gone.
I accidentally watched the live action Fat Albert movie from a few years ago, thinking it would be awful. And it was, but it was awful in a weird way. And it was still kind of heartfelt and still something where I'm like, oh.
You can see where they're trying to come from, but it just not.
Yeah, it was weird and it was sentimental.
Yeah, especially with the whole thing
more sentimental than it should have been.
Especially when the whole thing was where the Fat Albert kids are cartoons and they come into the real world and they have to get back to their cartoon world, and in the process they have to go and talk to Mr. Bill Cosby himself.
But it also ends with Bill and the friends that he grew up with who inspired the gang at the real Fat Albert's grave.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh. Gosh, I see where you're going there, but man, I did not come with you. I did not come with you. Oy.
All right, everybody. That is our list of top 5 Saturday morning cartoons. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you had your cereal. I hope you still had your pajamas on while you were listening to this episode. I hope you're listening at 5 o'clock in the morning. But if you're not, here's what you need to do. Head over to majorspoilers.com. In the comment section for this episode, share your list of your top 5 Saturday morning cartoons, or as a reaction to anything that we mentioned on our list. I'm sure there's going to be people going, I can't believe you guys didn't mention this. You didn't mention this. Also keep in mind, your Saturday morning cartoon run from like the 70s to about 85 was fairly limited to about a total of 6 to 9 to 10. So that's 4 hours. That's probably about 12 hours of cartoons per week. And that's all we could get. Today, you flip on the channel in the middle of the afternoon and you can get, hours and hours of content just on Disney Channel alone.
Well, also importantly, this was specifically Saturday morning cartoons, right?
Yeah.
So that disqualifies things like Batman the Animated Series, which was an afternoon cartoon, Gargoyles, anything in the Disney afternoon.
Any of that stuff. So yes, do keep it Saturday morning cartoons. And we'll check out your list and your reactions to our lists. Why? Because everybody loves a list. We'll talk with you soon. Take care.
This podcast is copyright 2018 by Major Spoilers Entertainment, LLC.